Helen Lewis, welcome back to the podcast.
Oh yeah, thank you very much.
You've written a great new book called The Genius Myth, and I learned a lot from it. I enjoyed reading it, and I also wanted to argue with the book, and so I'm going to argue with you.
Okay.
What is the modern idea of the genius, and how is it actually different from how people might have thought about that term in the past?
So one of the things I wanted to do with the book is look at what you can tell about a society by who it puts on a pedestal. And so the original meaning of genius in the kind of classical tradition is that it's a visiting spirit. You know, if you are a poet, you are visited by poetic spirit. It suffuses through you and speaks through you. And that's not our idea of the genius since really the Middle Ages. It's of a sort of special type of person. And so through Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Artists, you get the idea that kind of these Renaissance artists are special people. Then the Romantics, you get the idea that kind of poets are these special people. And then the Victorians come along and say, maybe there's a kind of quality called IQ that we can talk about. Some people are just, have these kind of better operating systems. And then I would say our modern idea of the genius, and is this the bit you disagree with, is I would say it's a kind of the tech innovator. And the highest ideal is kind of the young-ish guy who is not great at small talk or eye contact, but is, in one with the computer. That is our kind of modern idea of the genius.
I'll build suspense about the piece that I disagree with. No, I mean I can put it up. I can put it out early on. I think a lot of the myths that you take down in the book are myths and are harmful, and I agree with taking them down. And I'm not sure that I'm willing to let go of the idea that some people just have very special talents that lead to works of art or lead sometimes to technological inventions or whatever it is that really are beyond the grasp of most other very talented people. And that's sort of what I was grappling with throughout the book. But I want to go back to this idea that I think is very helpful of this kind of divine inspiration. I thought of the novel, I think it was Snow by Orhan Pamuk, where the narrator is shown as this poet who just has these moments when a spirit seizes him and he sits down and he jots down this thing that came in his mind fully formed. And it really is, feels like he's just a medium of some outside inspiration. But that, of course, also has kind of limits, right? I remember, I went to university in your fair country, and in the library of my college, Trinity College, Cambridge, there's a poem by Wordsworth, and somebody went to see that poem by Wordsworth and was very disturbed by the fact that it had edits on it. And that, the poems could possibly have been different. What do you mean they could have been different? They're perfect as they are. So even if you think that it's this moment of inspiration and it comes to you fully formed and you just jot it down, that's a kind of myth of its own, right?
Yeah, I love that idea of the kind of the canonical version of something. I did English at university, and one of the modules was all about that in relation to Shakespeare. And the fact is that for most Shakespeare plays, we have the first folio version, but that might not be, that was reconstructed from memory. There would have been one version of the script nailed up next to the kind of, the stage at the Globe or wherever it was, and everybody would have learned their parts. It was a much more oral culture, so people just were used to carrying around a huge amount of stuff in their memory. So all the Shakespeare plays that we have are essentially, to some extent or another, reconstructions. Now, some of them, that's, hugely, like Hamlet, there are various versions of it that are incredibly disputed, and people will still patchwork together a version, and that's a big challenge to the idea that there is a Hamlet that is the kind of the supreme achievement of this guy called William Shakespeare. And I think you're exactly right to pick up the idea that what I'm not arguing in the myth is for this sort of deluded idea of egalitarianism. I think there is a version of that, and you see it, particularly it's associated with the left, is this idea that actually we're all kind of blank slates and no one is kind of more adept at anything else, and it's all environmental. And unfortunately that's just not true. I say in the book, you could give me 1,000 years and I could never paint water lilies or understand string theory. Like, it's just not in my brain to be able to do these things. But I think the thing... what you said is exactly right about those moments. And you must have had it when writing articles where some days it's just... I think you did a tweet about this once where you were like, some days you just have to accept it's just not happening. It's just nothing is coming out. I can't marshal my thoughts in any interesting order. And some days it's as if you're a kind of lightning rod at the top of a building, and it's just and it's the best feeling in the world. And it's like the kind of chasing the high of that every other time you write is that one perfect time that everything was just flowing through you. And I think that's probably what it feels like to creative people when they are on that hot streak in them, what they call flow, this kind of experience of being right at the edge of your abilities. But I think the reason I say I say in the book that genius does exist in the sense of moments of genius. It's very bad for people when they begin to think that everything they do is good. They are a genius. And that to me is the crucial distinction. There's a great Harold Bloom quote at the start, which is, it's hard to go on living without some hope of experiencing the transcendental. And I think that's very true. We do hunger for these moments of kind of extraordinariness, and the idea that there are extraordinary people who are, as you say, halfway between gods and gurus or whatever it might be. But the trouble is it often has a very bad effect on those people themselves.
Yeah, so that is, I think, an interesting distinction. But one way of thinking about it, which may have pitfalls of its own, is, you have a special talent. There's something that makes you a possible receptacle of this, right? This is not the idea of God just choosing somebody at random and letting divine inspiration flow through them. But what is inspired, what has that special character, is the work you create, and that is a moment of inspiration. That is circumstances coming together in a particular way, and it's perfectly fine to call Hamlet a genius play. But that doesn't mean that we should think that if Shakespeare was somehow reincarnated and gave us his opinion about, how to lose weight or, what to think about Donald Trump's tariffs, he would have some special insight into those kind of things. I think there's a lot in that. Now, of course, there is, as you're alluding to, a kind of counter myth, right? So if we're saying the genius myth is on one end, then with apologies to Malcolm Gladwell, who I actually think is often not taken seriously enough as a writer who I think makes very interesting contributions. But sort of the Gladwell myth of the 10,000 hours, right? Anybody who just puts in the necessary work, who works hard, perhaps anybody who is born into the right family that has the access and the socioeconomic status, anybody who is given support in the right way can become a great scientist, a great athlete, a great whatever. I don't actually think that's exactly what Gladwell meant by 10,000 hours and exactly what those studies say. I think it makes sense to think about those in terms of you're going to be at your best after 10,000 hours of serious practice of a particular subject, and that is what it takes to get to this sort of frontier of how good you can be at that. But, I can do 10,000 hours of painting, and I'm never going to be any damn good. Well, perhaps I'll be competent after 10,000 hours, but I certainly won't be.
Right, yeah.
I'm better than I am now, but I'm certainly never going to, it's just not something I have natural talent for. It's never going to be something. When we're good, and somebody who puts in 100 hours might be better than I would be after 10,000 hours, because they do have that special talent. And, they're going to be better than they are today after 10,000 hours. But they might very quickly advance, right? So the genius myth on one side, something like the sort of blank slate myth or the 10,000 hour myth might be on the other side.
Yeah, I think if you read Outliers, I think when you hear Malcolm Gladwell talk about it now, he's slightly surprised that that's the bit that everybody remembers for it. And that's what happens when you write a book, is that people find something in it that speaks to something, that of the moment. And I think that was the moment that it came out of, was people wanted to believe that what he was arguing was practice means everything. And I think you're right. The version of that is true is you need raw talent, and then you need to channel that talent. What I would say, from having read everything I've read for this book, is that very few people are savants in the sense of they just come out of the womb being able to paint. And I think he was very good about saying the Beatles might have been incredibly good, incredibly young, but they'd been working at being a band for a really long time, really intensively. Picasso was an incredible painter by the time that he was 20, but he'd also done an enormous amount of painting by that time. So that's a version of it that's portable. The other bit that he says in Outliers, which I think is true, is that he talks about this generation of computer geniuses, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and he says they were very lucky to have been born with the talents that they had at the exact moment that home computing became possible. And that's Stephen Johnson has picked this up about the kind of idea of the adjacent possible. You can have all the tools in your mental kit to invent YouTube, but if you're trying to do it at a time when internet connections won't support streaming video, it's wasted. Ideas have to kind of come at a particular time. But we don't really want to think that, right? We want to think that special things have been done by special people. We want there to be great men, they are usually men. We want there to be people who are agents, because that's what stories demand. Stories need a protagonist. We don't want mushy, you'll know better than me that historians are always desperate to insist on the fact that there are incredibly complicated social forces, but people still want to buy biographies of Napoleon. That's, that we just want stories about people and about human-sized decisions. It's like that we just our brains crave them.
In a way, I studied history at university, and I'm not sure that I learned much at the time, but some of the lessons are slowly trickling back into my brain as I see some historical changes myself. And one of them is about technological change. I'm just really struck by some of the texts I read in undergrad about how, the way that people wrote about politics in the 18th century changed because of certain refinements of a printing press, which made certain kinds of pamphlets possible, and that led to the rise of a public sphere, and it really led to, a change in the modes of literary production, as it might have been put at the time. And that all seemed quite abstract to me. I kind of thought, well, surely if people want to say something, they say it, and they do it in the way that they do. Living through technological changes, like not just the rise of social media, but now the arrival of Substack, I can feel that, right? I write very, very differently for an audience on Substack than I did or than I do in more traditional magazines, in part because you have that immediate relationship to the reader. You don't have to worry about an editor sort of cutting it down to a particular length, taking out the sort of stylistic little twists that you might put in an essay. You can do things like having series of observations about the world. I go to China for a week. I don't feel like I have a definitive essay about China to publish in, foreign policy or something, but I can share the kind of 23 observations that I might tell my friends upon my return and share them in that form. And all of that is possible in that new medium in a way that it wouldn't have been earlier. So I think this idea of the adjacent possible is clearly right? Somebody who has this amazing talent at something like coding, at imagining some kind of new technology, born into an Italian village in the 13th century, may just have ended up being a really bad farmer, right? And that's clearly right.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. And one of the things that Persuasion's been doing, I've been really enjoying, are those like little vignettes of a country. It's Kyrgyzstan, was that the most recent one, in Tokyo, where it is just it's not a coherent essay with what I reckon about such and such. It's not a take even. It's much more impressionistic than that. And because you've got a readership that have said, okay, show me whatever you've got, I'm interested. Also, I bet the nice thing about doing that is that you don't have to do the commas. You don't have to do comma Germany's far right party, comma. You can just assume that people know who the AfD are or whatever it might be, or like the names of politicians. Which when you're writing for a mainstream, or like you have to try and constantly be explaining everything. So yeah, I think that the other example that I think of a lot, my last book was on feminism, is what did more for women in the 20th century? Was it the second wave, or was it the widespread invention and adoption of the contraceptive pill? Can you have one without the other? And I think for all that we might want to say that, feminism changed women's lives in the 20th century, reliable contraception was absolutely part of that story. It gave women power over the shaping of their lives that no women in history had ever had before. And I think you can really argue that without that, you can't have all the feminist gains that you have during that time period. So again, like a lot of this is about trying to find the balance, isn't it? It's trying to find the balance between genuinely there are people who are interesting, special, talented, whatever it might be, but let's also talk about the moment that made them, and let's also retain a level of humility. I don't know if you've ever talked to anybody who's ever interviewed Nobel laureates, but people will go, I was just really amazed they weren't that impressive when I met them, or quite a lot of them go a bit mad afterwards. And I just think that having this like label on you that says extra special person, you begin to think that everything you do is special. One of the high IQ societies, Mensa, one of the things it wanted to do, and it was founded in the 1940s, was they planned to have opinion polls of their members on all sort of kind of great subjects of the day. And then they thought, well, this would be brilliant for policymakers. They'll be able to hear what the smartest people think. And actually, most of the research that we have shows that if you ask a lot of smart people about subjects they know nothing about, their intuitions aren't any better than anybody else's. People just do have domain-specific expertise, and that, but they don't. The temptation is always, and all the incentives are, to present yourself as a big brain.
So I think there's a very interesting distinction here, right? One question is, are there geniuses in the sense of somebody who has a very, very rare talent at a particular human activity, right? Is Niko Jokic just a better basketball player than 99.99999% of other people who had the same opportunities, who practiced as hard, who trained as hard? There's just something that comes together in this individual that makes him superior to that competition and allows him to do things that others were not able to do. Is, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart somebody who just, one of the amazing facts about Mozart, for example, is that apparently people who are very proficient at copying music, whose job it is perhaps to hand copy music, cannot gather the speed to copy as much music as he wrote and composed over the course of his lifetime, because he died at a young age, right? There's just something about Mozart's ability to imagine music that is just incomparable to others. And if that is the case, then perhaps there is a useful concept of genius that we should apply to them. There's something that makes them special relative to other people. Now, that's different from, do I think that Jokic has particular insight about social science? Or do I think that, Mozart would be good at telling you how to live your romantic life? I assume not. I mean, I guess I could probably listen to Jokic talk on some podcast. I have no idea what his political opinions are or his opinions about anything else. We don't have much insight into what Mozart thought about all kinds of things. I assume he believed a lot of pretty stupid things, right? But don't we just have to disentangle those two things? Isn't it just a matter of saying, yes, there are some people who just have some special talent, some special brilliance at particular human activities. That doesn't mean that there are these all-purpose oracles who we should think of whenever they mouth off about, whatever it is.
I think that's exactly the distinction that I want to make. And have you ever watched the film Amadeus, based on Peter Shaffer's play? I
have as a teenager or something, but yeah, it's very good, I think.
But it's brilliant because it's entirely, and it's actually the same structure as Hamilton, the musical, which is all told through Aaron Burr, who is just jealous of this guy who seems to be just, words pour out of him. And the same thing is true of Salieri and Amadeus. He just looks at this little squit who's obsessed with, scatological jokes, and he thinks, I worked so hard. Why did God give you this gift? And I think that there's so much about the mythology about how we talk about people who are special and talented. We want to believe that they are weird people, interesting people, different people. Part of that is about to deal with the fact that we're not special. And I think there is a feeling that you want somebody like, if you're Salieri, you want Mozart to be a special, superior type of human, because then it's fair that he got this great gift and you didn't. And I think that's, when I was showing this book to a friend of mine, he said, I think you need to make sure that you talk about envy in there, because we live in a kind of giant killing age and people want to tear down geniuses. That wasn't the case in different ages, although Thomas Carlyle's The Uses of Great Men, which is the kind of where that phrase comes from, he was already writing defensively about the fact that he thought hagiography, about hero worship, was a really good thing, and it had kind of gone out of fashion. But there's always this push and pull, because when we raise somebody to this level, often there's a kind of argument smuggled within it. And I agree with you, I'm totally okay with the bit where Mozart is music is pouring out of him, and that's wonderful. But what is the argument within it? Is the argument within it, about specialist education for certain types of kids? Is the argument about Austrian nationalism? Is the argument about whatever it might be? And I think that there's often a second thing going on when somebody is put on a pedestal. Some idea that they represent is also being put there too.
Yeah, that's very interesting, what you're sort of trying to accomplish by lauding particular people. And of course, some of that is for example, certain kind of geniuses were simply involved in the construction of a nation, for better or for ill, right? Part of a kind of imagined community in the 19th century was to pick particular writers that certainly were very talented, that certainly had made great contributions, and say they are now our Shakespeare, right? And so Goethe becomes that in Germany, and whoever else, Molière perhaps, or Racine or somebody becomes that in
the
France.
national painter. Yeah, I think so. I think it's happening now. Even like I think someone like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is kind of the Nigerian writer. She's the writer that symbolises this new Nigeria that's kind of building itself and feels like it's ready to take its place on the world stage. And I have this line in the book about Shakespeare, which is he started off writing for the Groundlings, and he ended up working for the Warwickshire Tourist Board. Because that's what it becomes. It becomes a kind of brand. And like nowhere do you see that more obviously, I think, than with Einstein and Picasso. They are just at this point huge brands. All of the Einstein money goes to the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, which is why you have these weird things where like Verizon and like gas meters are using claymation Einsteins to stand in for like a really smart person. There are a lot of people who are making money out of the idea of having these brands of genius basically at this point.
So how do we think about extraordinary achievement? Because what's interesting to me is that some people can make extraordinary contribution and they seem to me relatively ordinary, but when other people make extraordinary contributions in a way that I think does seem to show that they have some strange unique talent that is difficult to put in words, is difficult to quantify, but that does seem to set them apart. I mean, to think about, one area that I know very well, because that's what I did my PhD in, political theory. When I read John Locke, who has made very important contributions to the history of political thought, the way that the prose flows, the way he thinks about the world, I sort of think, I know 50 people today who could do that. They didn't come up with those insights at his time. Locke, I think, clearly had a way of having an insight into the world that was special. But there's nothing when you read his prose that makes you think this was a unique mind, right? This may really have been somebody who just seized the adjacent possible to a greater extent than his contemporaries. And so, again, I don't want to sound kind of, oddly blasé about John Locke, but I think in a certain kind of way, he feels to me like somebody who, within the ranks of very talented people, was comparatively ordinary and just worked on the right questions, thought about them the right way, seized the opportunity, was able to create really lastingly important work. I read someone like Thomas Hobbes, and just the way his prose flows, the way he thinks about the world. I mean, he's clearly also quite a strange mind. I mean, nowadays we probably say that he was somehow neuroatypical or something like that. But it's just, I don't know anybody like that. I don't know anybody who sees the world in that way. I don't know anybody who writes in that way. I think Hobbes, to me, comes closer to having that kind of unique talent that sets him apart. Now, that doesn't mean that Hobbes is more correct about politics than Locke is. It doesn't mean that Hobbes made a greater contribution to the world than Locke has. But it does seem to me to suggest that you can make a great contribution to the world without having whatever we call genius. But also there are some people who do seem to have something like genius, which doesn't mean that Hobbes' opinions were all correct or that I would want to take advice on him on any other subject. Yeah. But there was sort of some quid, something there that is unusual in a way that's not true of others, and that I struggle to find a better word for than genius, even if I too have some skepticism about the use of that term.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that part of it is about the fact that some biographies are more compelling than others and lend themselves to mythology. One of the examples I have in the book is Jane Austen, who lived an incredibly quiet life, and was excluded from some of these early surveys of genius in the 1900s because they kind of went through the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography with a kind of ruler and said anyone who's got kind of more than 8 centimetres, they're in. And there isn't really anything particularly interesting to say about her life. She turned down a couple of marriage proposals herself, which people kind of try and spin up into a sort of feminist legend. But she was a quiet observer of things that she hadn't seen herself. And there's no way you can kind of render that into a little storybook. And I think people people want it to be mythological. The one I also talk about on the same, to illustrate the kind of yearning for that is, of all the female artists of the Renaissance, who is the one that we've rediscovered? It's Artemisia Gentileschi. And that's because there is this incredibly compelling story about the fact that her father's apprentice tried to rape her. She testified against him, submitted herself to the thumbscrews, threatening her hands with which she painted herself. And then in the portrait of Judith and Holofernes, she put her rapist's face in the man who's having his head cut off by Judith. And this as a kind of feminist legend is just absolutely perfect. And so she's been rediscovered because it comes in this package, this branding package that every art museum wants to do now. Now, as it happens, I think the paintings are good enough. This is not what I'm sad about. But the fact is there are other people from that era and just before, Sophonius Aguisola, for example, who don't have this kind of mythology attached to them, and therefore they kind of struggle to survive or break through in the kind of Darwinian marketplace of biographies of people that you want to kind of champion, whereas Artemisia the feminist saint is a kind of compelling commercial package. And I think, I think that's a natural process. I don't think we'll ever get around it. But I think you're right. What you don't want to do is grade people according to how satisfying the mythology is. Not least, I have to say, because having looked and tried to read some of these biographies of geniuses, I just think that, how will I put this? I just think a lot of the stuff in them is probably bollocks. Like, I just think, the one I talk about in the book is Galileo. And like, Galileo is held up as this guy who stood up to the Inquisition. Yes and no. He died in his bed. He didn't die on a stake being burned alive as a heretic. He was political about the fact that he was going to talk about the earth going around the sun. But what we crave is that story of the one guy who knew he was right and the whole church was against him and he stood alone, because that's the compelling story. So I just think we should be very aware about the fact that the stories we tell about achievement mutate. They kind of grow towards the sun in these particular ways. And you can't adjudicate between Locke and Hobbes based on who is weirdest, who has the most compelling biography, who has the most compelling mythology. That doesn't tell you anything about the quality of their insights. It tells you maybe about why a particular person might feel more of a connection with one of those people than the other. And that's what so much of this is about what the kind of bridges across time are that connect us with some of these people. And, those change, nowhere more than I think in the idea of kind of military leaders who obviously have been championed for a long time. And I think lots of people, particularly on the left, would now feel very, very uptight about the idea that you would, like Winston Churchill being a very good example of somebody who's been straightforwardly hailed as a hero. And that makes a lot of people in Britain now very uncomfortable because he's also the guy who was involved in the Bengal famine. And so the argument about was Winston Churchill a genius in standing up to Hitler and getting, in his actions in the Second World War becomes an argument about your politics, really, and about whether or not you would forgive people for one thing, or, do you not care about colonialism, you champion him, do you not care about, nationalism if you don't, whatever it might be. This is what I mean about the arguments that are being... I'm just always interested, and you must be too, what are the arguments we're really having when we're having arguments about these people's value?
That is very interesting. And I think one of the fascinating things that you bring out in the book is about how elevating somebody because of their talent in a specific domain to this general purpose status of genius doesn't just potentially allow us looking past bad behavior, which is one kind of debate that we've had a lot in the last years, but perhaps is not actually that novel or interesting at this point, but encourages them to behave poorly in all kinds of ways. That if it's true that Jane Austen was excluded originally from some of the kind of pseudoscientific attempts at listing and cataloging genius in the Victorian era because her life was so boring, and so she didn't have sufficiently many characters devoted to her, sufficiently many pages devoted to her in the Who's Who or whatever the books were in the 19th century, then the person who wants to be recognized as a genius has to make sure that they live life in a larger than life way, because that is what we associate with genius in a certain kind of way. And I'm thinking here of a sort of distant acquaintance of mine who is a visual artist, who, I think clearly, in my estimation, leads a very unhealthy life, appears to be addicted to alcohol and other substances, probably needs a mental health intervention in order to be less unhappy and to, frankly, have a higher chance of living for, the years that she should enjoy, but who is celebrated in the New York art scene in part for being such a character, for being so outlandish, for behaving in such erratic ways, and particularly in a world in which there are few objective measures of achievement and in which subjective taste is as influential as it is in the kind of slightly weird world of contemporary art. You're right, but it's not just that she is a brilliant artist, she's undoubtedly talented, but it's not just that she's a brilliant artist and therefore we look past her strange behavior. It is that the strange behavior and the persona is what makes her sell her art. And so actually this art world is encouraging her to rush towards a premature death in that kind of way.
Yeah, I think there's, and I think that's when you go around art galleries now, it is really interesting to look at what they tell you about people's biography and how often that is used as a kind of measure of authenticity, that the art comes from some sort of pain. And that is, sometimes that's really cheap. There was a very interesting essay in Harper's a while ago about the kind of uses of people, particularly invoking their racial identity, perhaps, or that of their long forgotten ancestors, as being a kind of measure that they were in touch with something that then gives their art some kind of deeper spiritual meaning than if it's just a pretty painting or whatever it might be. I think alcoholism is a really good example, because I think there are people who think that being creative is really tough, because sometimes it comes and sometimes it doesn't. And I think when people have had success creatively, they are often perpetually worried that it's going to just dry up and the gift is going to go at some point. And that's the kind of thing that encourages people to spiral in terms of their behaviour. At the same time, if you are in any way successful, you will always have enablers around you. The one that, when you were saying that, what it made me think of is, I think it was Christopher Hitchens' second wife, Carol Blue, said about him and his drinking, that people would come and see him in DC and they wanted their big night out with Christopher Hitchens. They wanted to wake up in a gutter at 4 a.m. because they'd heard all these stories about the kind of hard drinking guy that he was. And that was kind of great for them. They got their one day where they, got to kind of experience this wild life. But he was living it every single day. And I think that's the point, isn't it? We want these people to live these outrageous lives so we can kind of just touch them a little bit, but with no real thought about the kind of cost of living that life every day. But it also comes back to something that I've got a book behind me somewhere here that I was reading when I prepared for it, which is called The Price of Greatness. And we also, in terms of like the storytelling that we crave, we want some great talent to exert a particular cost. That feels like the universe is balanced. We want it to be, if you're Mozart, you get the talent, but you're also a sort of child and you die young. That's kind of an incredibly compelling story. If you're Beethoven, you have this musical talent, but you go deaf, whatever it might be, or you neglect your wife, or you never speak to your children, or, you're Isaac Newton and you spend your whole life living in a Cambridge college, or you're Yayoi Kusama and you check yourself into a mental institution and you have been there for 50 years. We want to believe that you don't get the juice without some kind of payment for it. And I think that's the other thing that's the problem with boring geniuses, is that because they don't seem to be suffering, we also downgrade their achievements for that reason.
Well, it speaks to the question, doesn't it, of why every great musician seems to die at the age of, is it 26? In
27, yeah.
27, right? And presumably part of the answer may be that this myth, as you call it, of the tortured genius is somewhat true, that people who are particularly creative might also have a tendency towards mental illness or towards success or whatever. Part of it is that if you achieve great fame at a very young age, it probably encourages you to live in very, very unhealthy ways. And part of it is the other way around. Part of it is that perhaps, the musician who dies tragically and romantically at 27 can't go on to produce 7 more albums that are increasingly mediocre and out of keeping with the times, and slowly people decide that perhaps he wasn't so great after all. Whereas if they leave the scene at the young age of 27, at the height of their fame, we're always going to remember them as standing at the center of their culture, as being these innovative forces. You can't grow into an old, resentful fart who keeps repeating that same song from 40 years ago and mouths off about stupid topics on the news.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I have a chapter about the Beatles in which I explore this, because I can't remember, it's David Gallenson or Hans Ising has a theory that if you want to be hailed as genius, you need to die before 30. So it's all the terrible, promise lost. So you're Keats, the poet, you're like, you're Amy Winehouse, whoever it might be, River Phoenix, James Dean, you're these kind of, you only ever were beautiful and young, and then you were gone. And or, and I want you to pay attention to this, Yascha, because this is the zone that you and I are in, if we ever want to do this, we have to keep marching on until you're over 80. At which point you hopefully become the inspiration for a younger generation who read your work and really like it. And you become, I don't think either of us are going to become father of the nation, but you know what I mean? So the idea is so in the Beatles, you have one of each. You have John Lennon, who gets shot at 40. So I think let's be honest, given his political tendencies, he would have grown into a reactionary old fart. He would now be airing some sort of slightly wince-making views about the small boats crisis. And you have Paul McCartney.
I do not know enough about John Lennon to have predicted that. What makes you say that?
Well, because he was very spiky. And, they had a whole song about how they didn't like paying... they were paying ridiculous rates of tax, but they had a whole song complaining about their tax bill. That's the kind of political arc that kind of you can see the direction that it's going in. The kind of Eric Clapton. I think he would have followed the Eric Clapton trajectory. But on the other hand, you have Paul McCartney, who has lived long enough to have become this sort of site of pilgrimage, right? He's gone, the younger artists want to go and work with him. And then he goes and performs at Glastonbury and has an isolated audio track of John Lennon, still young, captured. And so you've got one of each in the Beatles. You've got one father of the nation, the inspiration for all the next generation who idolise him, and you've got one taken from us too soon. And that's one of my answers about how, the Beatles became the kind of huge juggernaut band that they did. And again, the other thing being that they broke up, and it's the wildest statistic is I think George Harrison was 27 when the Beatles ended. The vast majority of his life he was not in the Beatles, and so you've got this, they pumped out a lot of albums in this time, but you've got this thing that's perfect and beautiful. And as you say, that you don't have the disappointing, we just cashed in because one of us has been through a bad divorce and we need to pay the bill tour that tarnishes your cherished memories of them. There are all these other factors that affect how we feel about stuff that isn't purely about the level of achievement. And the Beatles are a really good example of that.
Well, one of the things that makes sure that you don't cheapen your brand by appearing in, diaper ads is that you're dead by the time that you might have a financial need or desire to do so.
Yeah, also, I say this as somebody who feels pretty middle-aged most of the time. Middle-age is just kind of sad, isn't it? It's just a sad, decline. And, it's got lots of consolations. I'd rather be alive than not. But there is something about those people who will only ever have been young and beautiful that I think we just find really compelling.
Another thing you talk about is the attempt to sort of look at genius as a scientific endeavor, to measure genius, to predict who would turn into a genius. And that gives rise to everything from, a study where you try and give people IQ tests early in their youth in order to predict who's going to turn into a genius and who doesn't, to, of course, a favorite subject of fun in the book and in the broader popular culture, all of these societies like Mensa that try to say, we're going to administer an IQ test to you, and then this is going to be the club where the geniuses hang out. And of course, it turns out that a lot of the people who hang out in the club, and certainly the ones who are vocal about being members of Mensa, often don't appear to be geniuses in the sense of, having any particular achievements to their name in the real world.
Yeah, I find high IQ societies really compelling for that reason. On one level, I think they're in their original form. There was something lovely about them in the sense that the two people in real life I know who took Mensa tests as teenagers both grew up in working class households where no one had been to university, and they were brighter than the people around them, and they felt slightly, like they didn't quite fit in. And so they just wanted to talk to people who were a bit more like them. I think it's like the least sympathetic thing in the world, isn't it, for people to complain about the fact that, they want to talk about, French 18th century literature and no one they know does. But I think genuinely for people like that, it does feel like they are outsiders in that way. And that's the group noun that some of the people who were in high IQ society suggested should apply to them, outsiders. But the bit where you're absolutely right about where it tips over into being poisonous is this idea that although I've got nothing to show for my life, in the sense of like maybe I didn't finish university, maybe I haven't ever held a particularly good job or had a relationship, I know I'm a special person inside because there's this number that says that I'm better than you. And you do find a little bit of that tendency. I write just not about the high IQ societies, but the ultra high IQ societies. And that's where you get people who are really obsessed with the idea that they are super smart, even though they don't have anything to show for it. And I think that's where it becomes quite corrosive. And so Grady Towers, who was a member of one of these societies, writes about that. He said, if you get a smart person who grew up in a middle-class family that was a stable background, a home where there was enough food and people weren't violent, they become an architect. They don't need a high IQ society.
Right, they acquire the high status in the world through their achievements, through using their intelligence in order to design buildings or become engineers or whatever it is that they're going to do. And they don't need to go around saying, do you know I'm a member of Mensa, or do you know I'm a member of whatever other genius IQ society, right?
Yeah,
it is the people...
Mega,
Yeah, I was really struck by this in the book. It's the people who don't have those achievements, who flail out of life for any number of other reasons, who make that central to their identity.
Yeah, there's a line I really love in Pride and Prejudice, sorry, I'm obsessed with Austen today, by Lady Catherine de Bourgh, where she sees Elizabeth Bennet playing the piano. And Elizabeth Bennet's not very good, but she's trying. And she says, she said, I don't play the piano. She said, had I ever learned, I should have been a great proficient. And I just think quite often I will read a comment on the internet and I will think, had I ever learned, I should have been a great proficient. Because it's this eternal human impulse, isn't it? Like, I know I could do that better than you. I haven't tried, but I'm pretty sure that I could. And I think that's again, it's just this really human impulse to sort of think that there is something within you that makes you sort of better than other people who've just tried and been mediocre, and actually a fear of failure that you don't want to try. I think it's Maslow writes about this. People don't just have a fear of failure; they have a fear of success. So in both senses, it's really awkward. So either you fail, and if you tried, that's bad because you definitely can't do it, rather than leaving it an unanswered question. Or people have a fear of success when they succeed and they know that will make them different to other people and other people will resent them. And again, like for geniuses, it's hard to be the object of everybody's attention. I think that level of status and acclamation warps people, basically. If you are, also to go back to our rock stars, their managers sort of giving them the amphetamines. All these people who are invested in brand you, they want you to keep that show on the road. I thought of this really strongly in a different context when I was writing my Atlantic piece about Jordan Peterson, the psychologist, who had this terrible situation where he became physically dependent on benzodiazepines. But he carried on the world tour. And you kind of think, why did you do that, and why did the people around you let you do that? And I think that there's a feeling sometimes with these people who are phenomenally successful that they are, this whole juggernaut, this machine depends on the one human frail person at the centre of it, and them as a human gets kind of forgotten in that. And that happens to a lot of geniuses, which is why even the ones of them who I think become slightly monstrous, I do feel sorry for them. Being special is also hard. For all that most people would love to have more acclamation, more status, whatever it might be, it's not an uncomplicatedly happy experience for most people.
Well, and of course, it's not a coincidence that so many child actors, for example, grew up to have very, very troubled lives. The documentary about Amy Winehouse, which I think is very good, brings out that need of everybody around her for her to keep functioning, to keep the machine going. And the way in which that obviously encouraged her most self-destructing impulses. I also thought about that in another context, not a genius, I think, which is Joe Biden. What I was really struck by in the months when he was clinging to running for re-election was the fact that his own family members, and in particular his wife, seemed very keen for him to run again. And I just thought, what a disregard for your loved one who clearly is struggling, clearly is mentally impaired, and clearly just is exhausted, that for whatever reasons, you feel such a need for them to stay in political power, but you don't seem to have their best interest as a person at heart.
I'm really interested when the new book, the Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson book, comes out, which I haven't read yet, which seems to portray it as more malignant than I think I've seen in any of the reporting so far. All the reporting I've seen of that so far has painted it as essentially a kind of group delusion, which is that acknowledging that he wasn't fit to run again would have been so psychologically difficult for all the staffers who would have to, someone who'd have to tell him, for his wife who'd have to accept it. My colleague Frank Foer, who wrote a brilliant book about Biden, compared it to when, you've got a parent who's really elderly and you have to tell them that they can't drive anymore. And they're never going to drive again. So it's not like you're ill and you're going to get better. It's like this part of your life is over now. You have to accept that you're not the person you were. And how hard to do that to someone you love. And you're right, like someone else who I think some people would call a genius, I think it's true of Donald Trump. There are millions of people, there are thousands of people in the Republican Party who don't think he's fit to be president. They've never thought that. Some of them are on record as having said that. But now they will say that he is, because their fortunes are so tied to him and the cost of speaking out is so high. I think you have to understand the kind of beehives that get built around these people. And that's true whether or not it's any kind of... what I'm writing about in the book often is about fame and celebrity and commerce and genius being a sort of branch of that, in that everybody wants to keep the show on the road, whether it's Amy Winehouse or Joe Biden. Everybody's invested in that person and as a project.
One of the things I found striking is that, there's this attempt to identify early on who's going to be a genius, and that attempt mostly fails, right? So people go out and administer all of these IQ tests, and some of the people who do end up winning Nobel Prizes and being very influential end up being just below the cutoff, though they still actually are shown to have particularly high IQ. And obviously many people who are shown to have very high IQ don't end up doing anything particularly distinguished in their lives, whether because of circumstances, the time of World War II, etc., or just because of personal failings. I wondered about which way to read that as evidence, right? I think it shows that whatever genius is, whatever the qualities that allow us to have particular achievements in specific fields is, it's not just IQ, right? First of all, you have to have other kinds of circumstances where you have to have opportunity, right? If you're an African American in 18th century America, your talents are going to be wasted no matter how intelligent you are. If you're a woman in a society that doesn't give women opportunities, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to make productive uses of your talents. Certainly not to the same degree that a man with the same talent might be able. If
you're Jewish in early 20th century America and they have hard quotas on how many Jews can go to the Ivy League, right? I think there's some of the. I was surprised when I looked into it quite how many different groups of people had been ruled out of opportunities. I think that. One of the other ones that gets me is the Soviets, the kind of like who was allowed to prosper within that system was extremely rigidly controlled. Like how many great mathematicians did we lose to the fact that if their parents weren't party members, they weren't allowed to progress on through the ranks. I think, go on, sorry.
And by the way, the national quotas that the Soviets had, including the quotas on Jews, which counted as a national category in the Soviet Union, right? But where I'm trying to go with this is that I buy it takes all of these different factors, right? And clearly an algorithm that says, if you have particularly high IQ, you're going to go up to a genius is clearly wrong. And all of these dysfunctional members of these, super high IQ societies show that. I guess there's two things on the other side, right? Like one is that it does appear to be the case from other studies that people who have extraordinary achievements in most fields, including sports, by the way, tend to have very high IQs. So I think it is very hard to have extraordinary achievement if you don't have some special mental talents. But the other thing to say is that you could read all of this as a support of a kind of genius myth, right? Which is to say, look, what it takes to make this extraordinary achievement is something special. There's some special source that isn't reducible to a number measured by an IQ test, or that isn't reducible to the sum of different influences, right? Like, you look at Niko Jokic, and he obviously has physical talents that predestine him to be a good basketball player. He's tall, he's strong, he's fast, right? But the extent to which he's good seems to go beyond just those individual ingredients, right? If we had access to William Shakespeare and we could test his IQ, I'm sure it wouldn't be 75, I'm sure he had high IQ, and I'm sure he had other talents, and, but it's not the case that if you looked at him at the age of 16 or at the age of 20, you would have been able to administer the right tests and predict that he was going to go on to just be more creatively impactful than all of his, or virtually all of his contemporaries, right? And so you could take that same study that fails to identify those geniuses and say that's not proof that genius doesn't exist. It is proof that genius exists, that there's something that comes together in people that we can't express, that we haven't figured out, there's no formula, that just makes them have these extraordinary achievements and is not reducible to these simple things.
That's the version of genius that I like, which I think of as like the genius as lightning strike. You put yourself in that fortune favours the prepared mind. You put yourself in the place where all of these things could happen. You go to Silicon Valley in the 60s because it's where exciting things are happening and you're interested in technology. You do it. You get yourself as prepared as possible. You meet them, as many interesting people you have, and then it's kind of in the lap of the gods. I think that's a fundamentally healthy way to look at genius. But you're right. The problem with the way that the IQ test developed, they were originally developed, as I'm sure you know, to test kids who were falling behind. This was an idea that they were going to help people at the lower end. They were not supposed to sort of, show you this race of super beings at the upper end. But you marry that with the kind of late 19th century interest in eugenics and Francis Galton, who was a brilliant man in many ways, but completely without kind of any human empathy, as far as I can see, classing humans into these different gradations by how special they were. That collided with the IQ test to kind of get this idea about the idea that there was sort of strata of people. And I think you're right. I talked to Stuart Ritchie, who wrote a very good book, Short Introduction to IQ, about this, when I said someone like Darwin, was a kind of a plodder, a methodical plodder. And he said, okay, but don't overstate it. He will have been very clever. He will not have had an IQ of whatever you would might say now, like 70 or 60. He will have been a smart guy. Maybe he wasn't, 180. I think at the higher bands anyway, it's very hard to norm the tests, right? They're just really kind of made up at that point. But, you will have had people who are relatively smart, and then there will have been circumstances in their lives or other personality traits. And again, I think that's a more healthy way of looking at it, is to kind of think about what have I been given and what is the best place to exercise those talents? Where can I go and do the most interesting work? And of all the people currently thinking in Silicon Valley, a lot of them I don't really have a lot of time for. One of them that I do is Paul Graham, who's one of the founders of Y Combinator. And he said, when you're 20, go and look and think what you think the most exciting place in the world is and try to move there. And I think, because he talks about the, Milanese Leonardo, he said there was this incredible flowering of people in Florence during the Renaissance, and there's just a list of them. But there was just not that happening in Milan, which shared many of the same characteristics, same essential system of governance, same levels of violence, whatever it might be, same religion, all of this kind of stuff. And so there was something special happening in Florence particularly that was a kind of network effect of all the people that were there. And you want to be in the same place as all of those people. And I think, again, that's a healthier way of thinking about achievement. Go and be around really smart people. I mean, you've spent a lot of time working with universities. You'll know this. The idea of the university was that there would be interesting conversations that would happen within departments, between departments. It would be right, but this was the ideal, was that it was this kind of force multiplier of smart. Obviously, what it mostly leads to, as far as I can see from university management, is lots of people having very intense arguments about, minor admin issues and beefs with their colleagues. But the idea was that people being around other people who were smart in slightly different ways was incredibly energizing. It's why, I wanted to go back and work in the office after the pandemic, because one of the things I love about journalism is that there's a little project. It's it's us against the world. And I like institutions for that reason. Like a lot of them are very dysfunctional. Persuasion has talked about this very, very well. But in their best form, they are much greater than the sum of the individuals within them. And again, I think that's like a level of, I guess what I love in this book is a kind of plea for humility. It might be said you might be incredibly smart, but there are all these other factors that have helped you exercise your maximum potential, and we should look at those and consider those and try and maximize them for everybody else as well, basically.
Yeah, and that's something that I really like about the book, that it's called The Genius Myth, and it is trying to take certain myths about what a genius is down, but it's not dismissive of the idea that some people have special talents. It's not a book that rests on the idea of a blank slate. It doesn't say that you can take anybody at random and train them up to be brilliant at whatever they might want to do.
Yeah, there's a bad, more politically correct version of this book, I think. And I wonder, I'd be really interested to see the reaction to it, because I think some people will want it to be that book so they can argue against it. And I don't think that's entirely legitimate. If you look at the history of IQ, for example, there was a big movement of people who were ultra environmentalists. Some of them made very good criticisms of the culture-bound nature of IQ tests. The way that they presumed everybody was a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant American from the late 19th century. But they also had this belief that everything was environmental. And that was, unfortunately, a kind of a wish rather than anything that was supported in the evidence. And you've seen people who are definitely on the left who write about IQ now, like Catherine Page Harden, just be very open about the fact that we know that there's a spectrum of intelligence in the raw IQ sense, and that says absolutely nothing at all about human dignity and worth. And for some reason we've decided that these two things are kind of yoked together, but we don't have to. Just saying that people's IQs follow a spectrum across the population says nothing else about whether those people deserve to live good and dignified lives. And that's the inheritance that we've ended up with that makes people very nervous about IQ.
And that's something, by the way, that from the beginning of our political tradition, we didn't understand when the founding fathers wrote about all men being created equal. For, of course, I note that it's men in that particular formulation. They didn't think that all men are equally tall or equally fast or equally smart. They didn't have a concept of IQ, but they certainly recognized that some people have greater mental faculties than others. What they meant was the political point, that we should have political equality and each have a voice in the government, and that we should have equal dignity as people who are living today. But I think what I like about both the book and this conversation is that it does lead us to, perhaps not dismissing the idea of genius altogether, but as landing on a richer account of what it might be, right? That genius lies particularly in the special contributions that people are able to make. That some people do have special talents and a special ability to just outshine their contemporaries in ways that we should appreciate, particularly in a culture that likes to tear things down, or in a culture that likes to value mouthing off on a podcast or looking pretty on Instagram over real achievements in the world. I mean, there is actually something really comforting about cultural norms that say we are able to look at this person who runs faster than anybody else, who writes music that's more beautiful than anything anybody else is able to accomplish, who is able to, whatever it is, make a technological innovation that really advances our society. And we're able to admire them for that. We're able to sit with our inferiority and their superiority, right? We're able to sit with the fact that they've accomplished this. But we also need to be aware of the fact that it was only possible because they were lucky enough to have their talents match the needs of that moment, to seize the adjacent possible, as you put it very nicely. That it doesn't mean that they're necessarily good people, that it doesn't mean that we should lionize people if they act eccentrically in order to turn themselves into the sort of archetypes of what geniuses are supposed to look like. And it certainly doesn't mean that we need to listen to them in their political opinions about whatever they're mouthing off about.
Yeah. I mean, is there anyone you think you'd be, apart from your basketball player, which I have to say, every time you mention it, I'm just like, it couldn't be further over my head, but like that you think of and you just think, how did you do that? Because that's what I write in the book about. I really love Van Gogh's paintings. And one of the things that I found about looking at is he borrowed a lot from ukiyo, a prints, from Japanese woodblock prints, and which would have been relatively little known in Europe at the time. So his audience might not have seen this idea, the colour blocking, the black outlines, all of that kind of stuff. That would have been very thrilling and new to them. That was very avant-garde. But when you find out about that, I don't feel cheated. When I see Van Gogh's alongside... in some cases, he started off initially just by directly copying out some of these really beautiful, like a bridge in the rain or whatever it might be. I don't feel cheated. I do feel slightly cheated when I look at some of Picasso's later work, and then I look at the kind of quote-unquote primitive pottery that it was kind of riffing on, because it just feels a bit like passing off. But there is something about the fact that the reason I would say that someone like Van Gogh had moments of genius is because you can see all of the influences, you can see where it all came from, and I still don't know how he got there. And that's the bit to me. It's the little kind of neuron jump that you just don't understand how someone made that connection that makes it transcendent for me. And who is your version of that for you? Who's the person that you look at or read or whatever it might be and you just think, how did you do it?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I was thinking about it as you were formulating it. I guess
it's the same question as saying, do you have a hero? Who, like, in some ways, right? Who is your...
Right. Well, certainly, it's hard to say that about your own time, but certainly a lot of the people we talked about, whether it's Shakespeare or Mozart or other historical figures, do seem to have just some level of talent, or more importantly, some level of ability to translate the talents that perhaps they shared with others into concrete artistic achievements that do seem to me to stand in a league of their own. Now, I think it's also true that, when I was lucky enough to be admitted to these elite universities, right, go off to Cambridge as an undergrad and then go off and do my PhD at Harvard, I sort of expected at some level to meet that special breed of people, to meet people, and I had enough imposter syndrome, but I didn't think that I was one of them, but I thought I would meet these other people who had these sort of talents that put them in a class of their own. And I don't think I've ever encountered a human being who I would think of in that way. Now, that's different from saying I never encountered a human being who was capable of making enormous contributions to particular fields that I very, very deeply respect. I've been lucky enough to meet a good number of those and have a number of them on my podcast. But that doesn't mean that, there is always this phenomenon, but the better you get to know them, the more it feels like the cooking with water, and the more you realize that the moment they offer their domain expertise, they can be idiots about all kinds of things, or personal failings, or, not know how to tie their shoes, or all kinds of other things.
Social media has been brutal for today's putative geniuses, right? Because one of the book ends with Elon Musk, who's a really good example of somebody who I think people on my side of the political aisle would like to say was just an idiot and a dweeb, and clearly, a moron from the start. And that's not true, is it? Like, he obviously was very successful at SpaceX and Tesla in ways that his enormous appetite for risk and his desire to simplify and his aggressive management style and creating the kind of cults around him did work. But also his tenure at Twitter has been bad for society, I would say. His time at Doge has wrecked parts of the federal government. It hasn't streamlined it, because guess what? Running the government is very different to running a business. And again, the other thing is, he had this whole mythology about how incredibly hard he worked. He worked so hard. He did one day at this country, one day in that company, which is very hard to reconcile with the reality, which is that every time I log into X now, he's tweeting a conspiracy theory to somebody. And it's just quite hard to maintain that sort of pedestal when you know too much about people, I think. So yeah, I know what you mean. I think it's harder now to idolize people, because you just to do so you have to make them somehow superhuman, and we are only too aware of the ways in which people are fallibly human when we know that much about them.
And I feel like that is the tension that I want to sit with at the end of the book, and perhaps the end of this conversation, which is to take a real tangent. I mean, I don't watch much reality TV, but I always found when a good while ago at this point, I got briefly into watching some cooking competitions and cooking shows.
Yeah.
And I thought there was just something fundamentally comforting about the fact that these contestants, even though sometimes the producers seem to stir up drama and they had rivalries and so on, did seem to have a genuine mutual respect based on their craft, right? There was something they were doing, and they was preparing food. And though you can have disagreements in taste, and it would be hard to, say what is the best dish that any chef ever created or something like that, you can be better and worse at it. And they knew enough about the craft that when somebody had gotten something really right, there was this just fundamental mutual respect that they gave each other for that, right? And I think that's something...
is what you're talking about, isn't it? It's virtuosity. And I agree with you. There's things where you can go on YouTube and watch someone speed running a video game, and they must, in order to do that perfectly, they must have had to play it 100,000 times. And there is something that's really, or like watching an acrobat, or somebody like that who is just at the top of their craft, executing it perfectly and flawlessly is... Yeah, I can know what you mean, isn't it? This is, yes. That you have, Yascha, that is the most highbrow reason anyone has ever given for watching, like, the Great British Bake Off. And it's actually a deep,
or shows that are even worse than that.
Than on the human condition is actually why I watch The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills.
But I guess the question to me is, how do we preserve that willingness to give praise, right? That willingness to recognize you are excellent at your craft, and that's something that's deserving of praise. And perhaps some people are so excellent at their craft that they stand out among their peers, that they genuinely tower above their contemporaries in some important achievement. And I think that is a beautiful thing about the world, and we should be able to express that. And at the same time, we don't want to mythologize in the ways that we are tempted to mythologize, as you chronicle in the book. And I think actually the book and the conversation have given me in my own mind clarity about how to combine those two goals at the same time. But that, I think, is the task. How do we preserve the wonder and the admiration and the generosity in recognizing these achievements with a healthy skepticism about all of the kind of myths that can really lead us down dangerous paths?
Yeah, I mean, I think about, Elizabeth Warren, when she ran for president the first time, gave that speech, became very notorious about, which was rendered in historical memory as the "you didn't build that" speech, which was an unfair passing of what she said, which was, if you're really successful, great, keep a big chunk of that, but you transported your goods to market on roads that we all built, the police that we all pay for keep you safe. And that's the bit I just want to hear a bit more of when people are really successful. And some of them do it. They talk about the teacher that inspired them. They talk about the kind of youth academy that gave them the chance. We need to talk about all the sort of support structures. And, it's now kind of looked down on when people talk about the fact that, their wife helped them out or whatever it might be. But like if there were people in your family or your friends or whatever, the acknowledgement section is a great bit of any book. One of the bits I most enjoy reading. But you have to be really open about the fact, I draw on so many people's work for this, and so many of my friends were cajoled into doing bits about it. There isn't a single piece of creative work. I always think about it's very unfair for my editor, Dante at The Atlantic, that he saves me relentlessly from writing terrible things on the internet. But it's my name on there, and people, will say, "I love your work," and you kind of go, "Well, it's not just my work," and that's, I just think, being more open about the invisible support structures would, as you say, be healthy to say, well done, you are a tennis professional, but let's talk about the fact that, your parents got up at 6 a.m. to drive you to practice every morning, and the youth academy that was paid for with the National Lottery grant, was key to that, and all of those things. I think we can have those conversations without detracting from the fact that people work really hard and excel, and that's something that's praiseworthy too.
Helen Lewis, thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.